Senators, I rise today to speak on Bill 235, an act to amend the Prohibiting Cluster Munitions Act. This bill may create provisions that would prohibit Canadian financial institutions from investing in entities that breached any prohibitions relating to cluster munitions, explosive submunitions, and explosive bomblets. Before beginning, I would like to thank Senator Atullah Jan and Senator Hubley for speaking so articulately on Bill C-235 and for helping to truly put an end to any part that Canada might play in supporting the use of cluster munitions. As you know, Senators, over the course of history, there have been weapons that are so horrifying that result in so many casualties that the world came together and decided to put an end to their use. Honorable Senators, I want to share a personal story with you. When I was in Sila, which is a town near the border between Turkey and Syria, I met a 25-year-old woman who told me about how her daughter had died. When her daughter was 3 years old, she saw a tiny orange ball in their garden. She picked it up and tripped while she was running towards the house with it. That orange ball was a bomb. In this tragedy, the young child was killed immediately, and the mother lost all of her limbs. Before the blast, the mother was a teacher and a very active woman in the community. Now this single mother sits on a wheelchair and depends on others to even feed, clean, or dress her. That is why Canada has passed laws prohibiting cluster munitions. However, we now have a situation where Canada prohibits the use of cluster munitions, yet we still allow people to invest in the companies that make them. Where companies produce mustard and nerve gases, landmines, biological weapons, these companies make their munitions some of the worst weapons that fall into this category and have been deemed too inhumane for war. These weapons lead to cruel deaths or potentially kill large numbers of civilians who have done no harm and have no desire to participate in conflict. Cluster munitions are one of those weapons. Cluster munitions, including weapons that are designed to carry many smaller munitions inside of them, called submunitions or bomblets. These weapons are usually dropped from the air so that they can detonate while falling and rain their submunitions over the ground below them. A single bomb can cover an entire square kilometer in submunitions. These weapons are at their most dangerous when they fail. An estimated 20% of all submunitions from the original munition do not detonate upon reaching the ground, leaving them there to act like a landmine for unsuspecting victims walking through the area. Each submunition is tiny, each being about the size of a tennis ball. However, upon detonation, each submunition can send hundreds of hot shrapnel shreds flying into their victims. As a result, cluster bombs can even be deadlier than landmines. Thanks to these features, cluster munitions have become known for the chilling reason their ability to kill large numbers of civilians. As Senators Atullah Jan and Hubley mentioned, 98% of cluster munition victims are civilians. Worse yet, many of these civilian victims are children. This happens because the munitions appearance, most submunitions look like small metal balls, usually between the size of a tennis ball and a baseball. To the children who see them, these submunitions look like toys. Children are curious. They want to pick up objects and see what they are. With cluster munitions, this curiosity leads to tragedies. A shocking 2 of every 5 cluster bomb victims are children. To truly demonstrate how horrifying these weapons are, I would like to share the story of cluster munition victims. This is a story of Ram Vet, a Cambodian farmer. When Ram and her brother were young, they were both given the job of working in the nearby fields, despite the fact that many active submunitions were still in the area after the Cambodian Civil War. Ram and her family worked in the field because that was their livelihood. If they did not continue to farm, they would not be able to live. They would not be able to eat. In 1992, Ram's brother stepped on one of these submunitions, instantly killing him and leaving Ram legless from the right knee down. Despite the tragedy she faced, Ram still farms the fields every day, knowing that she might encounter another cluster munition. Ram is far from the only person who lives in fear of cluster bombs like this. U.S. bombing data shows that 26 submunitions were dropped in Cambodia during the Cambodian Civil War. Currently, an estimated 6 to 7 million of them are active and could repeat this kind of tragedy. Other countries face even worse circumstances. During U.S. bombing missions between 1964 and 73, 270 million submunitions were discharged across Laos. Out of these bombs, a stunning 80 million failed to detonate. According to a 2009 survey, this has led to the death or maiming of 50,000 Laotian civilians. These are far from the only examples of cluster munition use. Other countries like Cambodia, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Georgia, Libya, South Sudan, Vietnam, and Yemen all have been affected by cluster munitions, forcing its inhabitants to live in fear of being killed by submunitions. Thankfully, Canada has taken the decisive action to eliminate the use of these weapons and to reduce the harm that they have done. Between 1996 and 2011, Canada provided consistent funding to help efforts to remove the 80 million active submunitions from Laos. In 2008, Canada joined over 107 other countries and signed the Convention on Cluster Munitions, which prohibits the use, transfer, and stockpiling of all cluster munitions. By 2015, Canada followed through with its commitment through Bill S-10, an act to implement the Convention on Cluster Munitions. In fact, the Bill S-10 even went far beyond even what Canada had agreed to in the original treaty. Rather than simply prohibiting the use, transfer, and stockpiling of cluster munitions, we also took action to help the victims of these terrible weapons. After the bill was passed, Canada also provided rehabilitation to survivors of cluster munitions and even provided assistance to efforts to clear areas of submunitions. I'm proud of our history of eliminating and undoing the damage done by cluster munitions. However, Senators, there is still work to be done if we wish to truly eliminate any role that Canada plays in the use of cluster bombs. While the act to implement the Convention on Cluster Munitions may have stopped Canadian financial institutions from directly contributing to the creation of cluster bombs, there are still loopholes in our laws that allow for us to play an indirect role. According to PAX, a Dutch peace group, Canadian institutions invested $565 million into companies that produce cluster bombs between June 2012 and 2016. That makes up approximately 2% of the entire world's investment into these companies. It also makes Canada one of the 28 countries in the entire world that has failed to create legislation prohibiting this kind of investment. When Canada's financial institutions invest into producers of cluster munitions, we cannot say that Canada is truly a leader in ending the production of these weapons. Thankfully, Bill S-235, whose sponsor is Senator Atul Lajan, takes decisive action to put this practice to end by amending Section 6 of the Prohibiting Cluster Munitions Act. It adds a new subsection to the Act prohibiting Canadian financial institutions from investing in entities that have violated any of the other prohibitions in the current Prohibiting Cluster Munitions Act. Bill C-235 also closes other existing loopholes by prohibiting Canadian financial institutions from loaning funds to these entities and even prevents them from acting as a guarantor for their loans. By accomplishing this, Bill S-235 effectively seals any paths to funding the continued use of cluster munitions. Before concluding, I would like to share one final story with you. This is one of a small child who was nearly killed by cluster bombs. Nabi Besseh from Lebanon was only a baby when cluster munitions were being used in Lebanon in 2006. However, many years later, his life would be changed by their use. Like many others, a single submunition from a cluster munition did not detonate upon hitting the ground. Instead, it remained active for many years. Hassan came across the submunition after going to play and swim with his twin brother and cousins. When Nabi's twin Hassan picked up the submunition, hot shrapnel covered his face and tore open his abdomen. By the time that rescue teams had reached the group, all the children were in critical condition. When the children had arrived at the hospital, it took an entire hospital team of trained medics just to keep these children alive. Honorable Senators, this is the horror that is caused by cluster munitions which have been used in countless countries across the world. There is simply no excuse for a Canadian financial institution to put its money in entities that would allow for their continued use. Cluster weapons are simply inhumane. This is why Bill S-235 has been created by finally stopping these kind of investments. Honorable Senators, in conclusion, I want to share what Senator Kenney, Senator Black, and I had the privilege of visiting the Royal Canadian Air Force Base in Cold Lake. We were invited by Minister of Defense, Minister Sargent, and Lieutenant General Michael Hood, Commander of the Royal Canadian Air Force. I would like to thank them both for this extraordinary opportunity, as I also had the privilege of working with Lieutenant General Hood in Darfur. When I was in Cold Lake, I learned a lot about the intricacies of the Royal Canadian Air Force and learned about the rules of engagement in detail. I asked many questions about cluster munitions, and I was told by all the Air Force fighter pilots that they are particularly trained on cluster munitions and by the Canadian Armed Forces. Honorable Senators, they are trained that they are never ever to use cluster munitions. Cluster munitions are among the worst of inhuman weapons, and it is our responsibility to work toward this eventual elimination. If our men and women who risk their lives on our behalf are prohibited from using cluster munitions, then I agree with Senator Atulajan. We should also prohibit investing in cluster munitions. Thank you very much.
Senatrice Motion.
Senator Motion.
It's just a matter of understanding. I've been in financial institution a long time, and there are reports that you can receive about the type of financing that is done by financial institutions. Have you asked to receive these reports to see how much investment is put by banks in cluster financing?
Senator Monson, that's a very, very important question. And this bill will now go to committee, and I'm sure that the committee is, I understand it goes to Foreign Affairs, and I'm sure that the committee will be looking into how the financial institutions look at these. What I've understood in studying the bill to speak at second reading is that there is many direct and indirect investment in munitions, and that is what this bill is trying to stop. And I'm sure that the committee will look at this in more detail.